to be with you this morning, here afternoon in Geneva. I'm going to share my screen. So the title is what you heard from Michelle, but I've added a little sort of note about the self-tuning brain, which is one of my favorite terms to refer to neurofeedback. And I want to just take a general outlook on plasticity mechanisms with neurofeedback, as well as this kind of special type of plasticity called homeostatic plasticity that I think is not widely appreciated and that we've done some research on recently. So to start with, I mean, in the literature of neuroscience that we know, generally there are two main mechanisms of plasticity that people have investigated, and they've come under the sort of topics of Hebbian plasticity, which is also called associative plasticity. And then the second one is the homeostatic type. Now, the Hebbian type is according to Hebb's rule, it's basically based on correlations. So it's more like the classic memory that you know, where certain changes occur in the direction of what you're doing, or how the neurons are working. So that's sort of, if you think about long-term potentiation, the LTP, then if there's high activity, spiking of the neurons, then you will have more and more synaptic strength. So it's kind of in the direction of the activity itself. That means it's a positive type of feedback, as you can see here. And so it's sort of changes that are unidirectional usually. So either they occur in the increasing synaptic strength or decreasing synaptic strength, but they're in the direction of the activity itself. Whereas homeostatic plasticity is a little bit more complicated. In fact, it's sort of bidirectional, and it does have this component of negative feedback, which means that sometimes has opposite effects of where the neural activity was previously historically directed towards. So, I mean, it will become a little bit clearer with some examples what the homeostatic type, both of these types. So I'll give some examples, but just bear in mind that one is more positive feedback based and the other one is more negative feedback based. That's mostly what you need to know at the moment. And I want to start, before we start to think about homeostatic plasticity, I just want to cover also the classic Hebbian type, which is what we're more familiar with in sort of neurofeedback practice. And one good example of that is this study by Zofel et al. That looked at alpha upregulation. So we all know, with neurofeedback, you sort of train particular brain waves or brain states, and that you expect the brain to give way or to be imprinted in that direction. So, for example, if you're upregulating alpha rhythm, then you would expect that, if there's a little bit of rhythm at the beginning, that's this sort of top row here, that if you don't have a lot of alpha rhythm, that after training, you would have more of it. So you're promoting alpha power, so-called alpha rhythm. And then you see here across the sessions, this is your resting state alpha, which is spontaneous alpha, and then it gives up within that one session across blocks. And then at the end, this is the resting state alpha. And then you start again another day on session 2, and then so forth. And you can see that there's this kind of general increase in alpha across time, whether within session or across session. And there's some kind of plastic effect here in the resting state that seems to accumulate over time, right? That's the sort of long-term plasticity of the spontaneous state that is being transferred through the neurofeedback. And obviously there isn't a perfect match between the last part of the session and the beginning of the next session. So there's some kind of decrease here that may be some kind of, effects that are not 100% plastic. So like sleeping or different things that might, but overall there is an increase in this resting value in terms of alpha. And that basically is reflected by this increased alpha rhythmicity here. So the reason why it's Hebbian or associative is because the training and the change in plasticity occurs in the direction of training. So if the direction of training was to increase alpha, which we can see here during the session, within session, then also the alpha increases in that direction. So the plasticity of the spontaneous states reflects the direction of training, okay, online. So offline changes are in the direction of online changes. Now, another example, more clinical one is, for example, training in children either with autism or even ADHD, the classic type of sort of neurodevelopmental delay, where we find that children with autistic spectrum disorder display usually higher power in these sort of slower frequencies like delta theta here compared to healthy. As you can see here, there's more delta and theta here, and that's the same case in many cases for ADHD, the so-called high theta beta ratio. Essentially, you can try to downtrain that power with neurofeedback. And then this is the study by Kujiter et al. That looked at neurofeedback training in autism. And this is now plasticity across sessions. You see they did 40 sessions in total. And most of these children had a decrease across time, in the direction of training. So whether you're up regulating a certain rhythm or down regulating the power of a certain rhythm, it doesn't matter. They're both classed as Hebbian because, again, in this case, the training is downwards. And in this case, the plasticity occurs in the direction of training, but now towards decreased power. So those are the two main examples of Hebbian plasticity. Now, I'm going to cover one of our studies that is a good example of Hebbian plasticity, and the basis of that has been in terms of reduction of alpha rhythm and how it's related to cortical activation. Now, you just need to see this slide here that displays a negative correlation between these low frequencies, such as theta, alpha, and beta, and sort of fMRI metabolic activation in the brain using a sort of simultaneous EEG fMRI. And conversely, there's instead a positive correlation for higher frequency rhythms like gamma. So essentially, that just shows that alpha is classed as an inhibitor rhythm based on metabolism. So essentially, the inverse correlation means that decreases of alpha rhythm are related to increases in cortical metabolism. And that's exemplified also by basically when one closes one's eyes, we can see that alpha increases. And conversely, if you do a difference between eyes open and eyes closed, then alpha decreases during eyes open and gamma increases during eyes closed. So usually when closing our eyes, the visual input is decreased, and therefore the alpha wave increases. So increasing inhibition in the brain. And here you can see the same concept. So during states of eyes closed, here the gamma goes down, whereas the alpha goes up. See there, and then conversely with eyes open. So essentially those two bands are kind of, let's say, antagonistic. Usually alpha goes up and then gamma goes down when the state is inhibited, when the brain is inhibited in a certain cortical area, and the other way around when it's activated. Now, we also know that there is a positive correlation between alpha rhythm and default mode network. So although there are some negative correlations between alpha and fMRI, in this one network here, which is outlined in red, the so-called default mode network, there is a positive correlation. That means that in those cases, alpha acts as a proxy, and you see here the negative correlation with the visual cortex. So basically, alpha is negatively correlated with sensory cortices like visual cortex, but with these sort of intrinsic networks like a default mode, there's a positive correlation. And this is a study that looked at correlations simultaneously with fMRI, and they show that these kind of patterns, where the DMN, the default mode network, is active, correspond to this kind of topography of alpha, where sort of a positive around sort of parietal areas there, occipital areas. So given that, and also there's this relationship between the default mode, we know that default mode is being implicated in a lot of internal processing, such as memory replay, planning, or self-processing, that it activates during these kind of cognitive states, as well as mind wandering when one thinks randomly about different things during the day. So the default mode network is positively correlated to sort of mind wandering when one mind wanders. And since there's a positive correlation also to alpha, we made the hypothesis that the alpha and the mind wandering would be also related positively. So one could technically try to modify mind wandering using modification of alpha rhythm as a neurofeedback protocol. Now, I spoke about alpha being an inhibitor rhythm, and also as a gate for external visual information. You can see that here during states of higher alpha, basically detection thresholds are increased. So in fact, visual information or visual stimuli are not, they cannot sort of come through the gates that easily, whereas when alpha is small, during higher states of cortical excitability, then these visual stimuli are detected. And therefore, one could think that alpha is kind of acts like a proxy for internal versus external processing. in terms of sensory information. So when alpha is usually low, that means during these green states here, externally oriented states, that would be when one is paying attention to the outside world, then we're processing the visual stimuli. And then when alpha is high, then we're in sort of internal oriented states like thinking or mind wandering. So that's a model for why alpha exists. Also is to block out irrelevant information if we're trying to process internal information like memories. So those two kind of information streams are not conflicting. So we asked the question whether, with neurofeedback training, we could increase the prevalence of this externally oriented state, and in so doing also decrease mind wandering. So basically promote this more sort of low alpha state that would maybe decrease mind wandering and would have relevance for psychiatric disorders that are related to sort of pathological mind wandering like depression and so on, like most disorders that have problems with thinking. So that was the initial reason why we investigated this protocol. And so we tried to do this alpha down protocol at PZ, which is the sort of maximum topography where alpha occurs. But this was in healthy subjects. And so we had two groups. One was exposed to real neurofeedback, and the other group of healthy subjects were exposed to sham neurofeedback. And we wanted to see the connection between this alpha changes after neurofeedback and changes in mind wandering and also the fMRI networks. So basically, we tried to do that, and this was the design of the study. We had the subject go first into the MRI machine to do an fMRI scan during an attention task where we assessed mind wandering. I won't get into too much detail, but you can look at the publication in your image. After that, they came out of the scanner, they did a 3-minute resting state EEG, sort of baseline, and then they did 30 minutes of neurofeedback where they tried to decrease alpha power. And then they again did the same thing afterwards where they did a resting state 3 minutes and then go back in the scanner and do the attention task. Essentially, the results are that we were able to show that the neurofeedback group was successfully decreased alpha, as you can see here. So from the resting state value here for the neurofeedback and sham groups that were equivalent, the neurofeedback group decreased the alpha during these 3-minute blocks of one session. So this is a one-session neurofeedback design, and they were able to maintain alpha reduced significantly compared to baseline for the full 30 minutes, after which the alpha returned to baseline. Whereas for the sham group, you can see that initially there was some kind of decrease in alpha because they were paying attention to the screen, but slowly, because there was no continuity between that and the neurofeedback, the alpha started to creep back up and they had a larger variability across time. So, and then if you're looking at the correlation coefficients, the neurofeedback group had a negative correlation across time between the alpha power and the period number, whereas the sham group had an increase. So you could say that sort of neurally, they were dissociated in terms of the neurofeedback training. So we would have expected they have different results in terms of behavior and the EEG. And so this is just a slide to show that the neurofeedback group successfully decreased alpha with this kind of topography, and that the sham group did not reach that level of significance. So the first interesting thing we found was that there was a coupling between the amount of changes in alpha during training, that means during neurofeedback. So this is an average during the whole session as a % change from baseline, and the change during pre to post neurofeedback. So that's the change in the resting state alpha pre to post neurofeedback. You can see here negative changes in pre to post neurofeedback correspond also to negative changes during training. So that basically implies that decreases in alpha during neurofeedback were translated to decreases in alpha in the resting state. So that's kind of in line with the Hebbian model, right? Direction of training leads to directional changes in the spontaneous activity. And this was across the board, across most electrodes, although we only provided feedback from the parietal area. Conversely, the sham group actually didn't show that coupling between changes during the training and in the resting state. So although there was some changes during that neurofeedback session across multiple electrodes, none of those changes really had any kind of predictive power for changes in the resting state thereafter. Okay, so that means there was no causality between what one did during neurofeedback and how it translated in the resting state afterwards. So basically the Hebbian plasticity there was missing, let's say. between the sham group. And we know that that probably could be predicted by the fact that the alpha changes were not as strong during training, but also they were more variable across subjects. So it just shows that you need to have successful neurofeedback to probably translate into plastic changes. And then in terms of behavior, we did sort of confirm this hypothesis we had that negative changes in alpha post neurofeedback. So this is pre to post changes in alpha. So here you would have decreases in alpha after neurofeedback compared to before neurofeedback in the resting state. Also were coupled to decreases in mind wandering pre to post neurofeedback. So essentially those people who decreased alpha the most after neurofeedback also had decreases in mind wandering. So it seems to support, which wasn't the case for sham, by the way. So you can see here it's completely opposite direction. The correlation was insignificant. So it goes to support that you could use this protocol technically to decrease mind wandering in healthy participants. Okay, for those that do translate and train well. Now, we also found correlations with the default mode, which is interesting because the default mode has been linked to mind wandering. So here you can see that there are some positive correlations between mind wandering and changes in default mode, plus also changes in resting state alpha and default mode. So that's in line with the literature that all these three variables are linked positively. So again, inducing decreases in alpha would decrease mind wandering and would also decrease this default mode connectivity. That's in line with literature. Now that's also fine according to the standard model of Hebbian plasticity, but then we hit a snag a little bit, and I'll get to that now, in terms of are there any kind of exceptions to this rule of the Hebbian plasticity model? And there's this saying by Thomas Huxley, the great strategy of science, the slaying of a beautiful hypothesis by an ugly fact. So we had a beautiful hypothesis, and I would try to reinterpret that as maybe the great serendipity of science, where we're slaying an ugly hypothesis by a beautiful fact instead. So I will show you what I mean by that, because I think sometimes even unexpected results lead to insights, and some beautiful discoveries can occur even when one makes mistakes. And by the fact that I think what the rationale was, and I'll go back to this, for this study was to improve mind wandering in clinical populations. And then this was work that we did in conjunction with Professor Lanius at Western Ontario. And basically our idea was to apply this protocol then to patients with post-traumatic stress disorder, who, as you know, they demonstrate a lot of sort of cognitive problems, also inattention. And we thought, okay, since they have racing thoughts and they have a lot of mind wandering, we would apply this protocol to those patients, given this sort of validation in healthy subjects between the behavior of mind wandering and these networks and alpha. So we applied the alpha down protocol to patients with PTSD. And what we found was, it was the same protocol. So we decreased alpha. You can see here, this was a group of 17 patients with PTSD. And we applied down regulation neurofeedback here. You can see here neurofeedback 30 minutes. And this was their baseline alpha at the beginning, resting state. And then after that, instead of the alpha being equivalent or maybe even lower than the baseline, which is what we would like to induce this sort of Hebbian change and decrease mind wandering, well, they had an increase in alpha. So paradoxically, there was this kind of rebound that we'd never seen before. And we scratched our heads for quite a number of months and years after that, trying to explain what is going on there. This just shows here that there was a successful decrease of alpha during neurofeedback that corresponds to this block here. But we really stumped about why we had this increase in alpha, because we didn't really want to have that alpha increase, sort of on paper, theoretically speaking. And then we managed to run another study 3 years later, where we actually finally got a control group, and we compared this alpha at baseline compared to some healthy controls. And what we found, interestingly, is that the controls here, controls minus PTSD, had actually greater alpha power at baseline compared to PTSD patients. So already at the very beginning, the PTSD patients had a lower alpha, significantly lower alpha than controls. And maybe perhaps that could explain why they had this paradoxical increase. So if we summarize that as a sort of effect, here's your alpha amplitude on the y-axis. See, and And basically, this is T1, this is the baseline alpha. And then we asked the patients to decrease alpha, so you can imagine that during neurofeedback, they went even lower. This is where I showed you here that this was lower than baseline. So this is the baseline T1, this is neurofeedback. And then after the neurofeedback, as I showed you, there was this rebound. But now we have a reference point here, which is the control population. And we can see that, in fact, this rebound goes towards the mean, not away from the mean of the controls. And if we consider that alpha, as I showed you before, is an index of cortical activation, so lower alpha means more cortical activation, then this decreased alpha in PTSD patients at baseline suggests that they're cortically hyperactivated, and that with an increase in alpha, they're going towards the norm of the controls, which are less hyperactivated. Okay, hope that makes sense. Now, why would that be the case? Why would that occur? Well, that's where we can bring in the concept of homeostatic regulation, and which is another word for control, frankly. And the word control comes from the sort of etymology is the counter control. So counter in the direction, of the direction that you're trying to go in. So this occurs, for example, in the house thermostat. This is an example of a closed loop control system, homeostatic system, where let's say you want to keep the room temperature at 20 degrees. So you set it at 20 degrees, that's what you want the room temperature to be. And at the moment, the sensor, the room temperature at the moment in your room is 15 degrees. So it's well below this sort of desired temperature. And then what would happen is that the thermostat computes a difference value between the reference that you prefer the room to be in, the so-called set point, and the current temperature. So that would be basically the 15 minus 20 degrees as the error difference. And that would lead to this -5 negative feedback error. And since the feedback error is not 0, but -5, that then provides information to the thermostat to start engaging the central heating to decrease this error. So that's the negative feedback, and basically keep warming up the room. And then as the room warms up, then this temperature, current temperature goes up to 16, 17, 18, 19 degrees. And as it keeps going around this loop over and over, the error starts to decrease to -4, -3, -2, -1, 0, and then the thermostat stops. So, I mean, the heating stops. So essentially, that's how this overall temperature of the room is regulated. So we can imagine that the brain has similar mechanisms at play where they want to keep certain values of neural activity or even brain states within a certain range that is beneficial to its processing, such as, for example, the excitation inhibition balance. So if we think that alpha is a proxy for excitation, sort of lower alpha means more excitation, then if you have too low alpha, it might indicate that the brain is too far away from its desired set point, and that bringing it back with homeostasis would be beneficial. So that's basically our interpretation of that effect, is that the brain, when you push it even further in that direction of increased excitation, the brain somehow brings back, there's mechanisms that kick in at which they bring back that alpha activity from being too pathologically low towards sort of intermediate levels that are sort of displayed by the normal population. So those are the three components of homeostatic regulation: the sensing, computation, negative feedback. And so within your feedback, basically, we get this kick of this negative feedback that kicks in the opposite direction of training. So you could think that homeostatic regulation is defined as an effect that is in the opposite direction of your neurofeedback training. Now, why is that interesting? Well, everything is interesting in the light of clinical symptoms. And what we found was that, in fact, this increase in alpha that these patients displayed, so this positive rebound, was actually related to decreases in arousal, just as we would expect from the sort of activation or hyperactivation kind of model, where less alpha, more alpha would be indicative of decrease of arousal. And you know that in PTSD, they suffer from hyperarousal symptoms. So in fact, they felt better after the session for those that had a rebound, and they sort of described feelings of euphoria and relaxation and calmness, which those ones that didn't have a rebound didn't describe. So paradoxically, going in the opposite direction of training leads to positive results. So that's why I call it the self-cheating brain. Now, put that into a bigger context. I showed you the slide already with this negative correlation between alpha and the high frequency rhythms, and sort of bold and positive correlation with high frequencies. Now, why would the brain want to do that in the first place? Well, we know something about this excitation inhibition ratio. And the main concept of excitation inhibition balance is that it is modulated to improve or adapt performance, so behavioral performance. And sort of this central nervous system arousal is sometimes modulated to decrease or increase the performance depending on the behavioral state of the animal. So during states of like grooming and relaxation, sort of rest and digest, arousal can be low because there's no need to exert, behavioral effort. There's no need to really pay attention to the environment. But during other states of sort of higher sort of arousal, one needs to be aware of environmental stimuli. So those states are linked to sort of higher cognitive performance. And this is shown here with this mouse study where they looked at the diameter of the pupil, which is another proxy for arousal. So the diameter of the pupil is directly linked to the sort of noradrenergic axis, where the sort of locus coeruleus activation increases the diameter of the pupil. And that's kind of can be seen as a kind of a direct correlate of arousal. And you can see here performance about how many behavioral errors these mice create. And in fact, the hit rate, the optimal hit rate is at an intermediate level of behavioral arousal, okay, which is at the intermediate level of pupil diameter. And in fact, then also the reaction time to licks is the smallest. That means that the more highest performance is around the same level. So it's intermediate levels of arousal that create the best performance. And if you go over aroused, you start to decrease performance. So it's possible that also in psychiatric disorders that are related to hyperarousal, you have these increased errors due to the state of the brain being too aroused. Now, how does that all fit with these with our EEG oscillations? They also recorded LFPs, the local field potentials, in these mice, and they found that in fact these oscillations track the pupil diameter. So you can see here these large waves that are so-called slow frequency rhythms, like I described before, the theta and the alpha rhythms, so it's sort of 2 to 10 hertz. They occur like this, and then and they occur during low levels of pupil diameter, low dilation of pupil. Whereas these synchronized states that have higher frequencies and are low in amplitude, they occur during states of higher pupil diameter, so higher arousal. And then you can see as soon as these lower rhythms kick in again, arousal goes down again. So these two are kind of simultaneous in time. And you can think that these lower frequency rhythms are a proxy, again, inversely related to arousal. So less of these lower frequency rhythms means increased arousal, and and then more of these rhythms mean decreased arousal. So here this would be decreased arousal state. And so they propose this model of optimal performance and pupil size and the predominance of these slow rhythms versus higher rhythms. And you can see here during the lower arousal states, the slow rhythms like theta and alpha are present. And then as you transition to higher arousal states, you have these higher frequencies like beta and gamma that predominate with a higher dilation of the pupil. One study to show you how this is linked to maybe neuromodulator release and medications that are used also in psychiatric disorders. Now, modafinil, interestingly, has been used in ADHD, for example. It's a class as a noradrenergic agonist, so it's sort of an upper stimulant. And that's linked when you provide modafinil to mice. Well, you can see there's this decrease of these low frequencies, such as 10 to 20 hertz rhythms like alpha. So that's in line with the model that increasing the cortical arousal and behavioral arousal of the animal decreases these rhythms. And conversely, if you provide the antagonist, then the power of these slow rhythms increases. Okay. Now, this is the overall model that people have proposed in this paper. And in fact, it dovetails nicely with the classic Yerkes-Dodson law that a lot of you will know from psychological theories, where you have this optimal sort of U curve, inverse U between arousal here and performance. So you can see here, this would be corresponds to focused, sort of organized attentive state That's during moderate levels of dopamine and noradrenaline, whereas the two other extremes would be too little noradrenaline and dopamine, or too much. Now, those two might look behaviorally similar in terms of inattention, but one is so-called stress state, and one is more sort of inattentive fatigue state or under-aroused state. So both of those can be linked to lower levels of performance. And if you think at the end of this axis, you would consider that that's where the PTSDs lie, right, in the sort of low alpha, highly aroused state, and that your classic ADHD, that children that usually take stimulants, would be these sort of the lower end of the spectrum, the other end of the spectrum. So that's sort of the classic model that, you know, children with ADHD that have a lot of theta rhythms would be on this end, and then therefore you would try to decrease theta in a Hebbian way to decrease arousal, to increase arousal, to go up this curve. Now, with the PTSD and the alpha rebound, what we've done is they were already here, then by whatever serendipitously, without knowing, we decreased their alpha further, we stressed them even further, let's say, in terms of arousal, but then the homeostatic system brought them back here towards the mean with beneficial effects. So this is the overall model for this kind of homeostatic and Hebbian plasticity of these brain oscillations. Now, based on that model, and this sort of, again, the assumption that ADHD looks like this, we went to try to do alpha down in patients with ADHD. Now, so this is the last study I'll talk about today, and that's a recent study where we applied the same alpha down protocol that we use for mind wandering and for PTSD. And again, we know that in ADHD, there's a lot of mind wandering. So we thought, okay, well, maybe we failed in PTSD in some sense to decrease alpha, but you know, in ADHD, there is some indication that alpha is high in adult ADHD at least, and we should try this in that population too. And that's based on the literature where they show that, you know, children and adults with ADHD usually show higher spectral power in these lower frequencies compared to controls. So, for example, children here, you can see there's a higher theta, the dotted line here, compared to the green line. And the ADHD children, they have higher theta and delta usually compared to controls. And then the power does decrease with time of development, but there is this remnant in the patients that always occurs that seems to be indicative of ADHD. So this increased alpha here could be indicative that they have too little activation, okay? And therefore that might be relevant to their symptoms of ADHD, and that's linked to the sort of cortical hyperactivation because there's too much alpha, too much of this low frequency. Now, those three studies seem to indicate this would be the case in adults, but we also found retrospectively another study by Liu et al. In 2009 that showed exactly the opposite pattern. So I won't go to the other colors, but essentially the red colors indicate under eyes closed what the alpha was, and they found that the no ADHD, i.e. the controls, had basically higher alpha than the ADHDs. So here the ADHDs actually have lower alpha than controls. In this case, here the ADHDs have higher alpha. So is this another ADHD subtype? Let's see. And so in this case, neurophysiologically, one would consider this subgroup to be one that's similar to the PTSD group, where they have lower alpha compared to controls, and therefore consistent with the model of cortical hyperactivation. But we went ahead and did the alpha down in the ADHDs before we looked at the control group. And we did have a control group, but we looked at the EEGs of that control group post hoc. And we applied the same alpha down protocol. That means that basically we tried to get them to decrease alpha again at PZ. So it's the same protocol across all these studies I've presented. And they had a resting state EEG before neurofeedback, and they did a continuous performance task assessing their attention, commission and omission errors. Then we did another resting state just before neurofeedback, then 30 minutes of neurofeedback of alpha down, then another resting state, and then another time to task. And then we tried to compare the performance difference between CPT2 and CPT1 versus these changes in the EEG, alpha EEG before and after neurofeedback. Okay. And similar to what we did with PTSDs. So what would we find retroactively after when we looked at the data? In fact, we did find evidence for this subtype, hyperactivated ADHD subtype in adults. which consists of the alpha rhythm being lower in power than controls. So not at all like the predominant literature where the alphas are usually higher in ADHD adults. So this would be considered a sort of hyperactivated subtype, which we didn't expect because our idea was to decrease alpha in this population, not to make it go away from the norm, let's say, right? And what we achieved was that we were able to decrease their alpha during neurofeedback. So this trace here, this red trace, is exactly the same thing as this red trace here, just different scale. And in fact, during neurofeedback, they were able to decrease their alpha further. So we, let's say, activated them even more during neurofeedback. Again, just like we did with the PTSDs. So what would you expect to happen in this case? Well, after neurofeedback, this is what we found. So we found a rebound of alpha, just like we did with the PTSDs, that again goes towards the direction of the control group. And it was above and beyond the initial resting state that was before neurofeedback, as you can see here. This is the initial resting state. And after neurofeedback, they had an increase in alpha that goes beyond that. So normalization of the EEG, again, in the opposite direction of training, consistent with homeostatic regulation mechanisms. And then the question is, and then we also showed that during the task at CPT2, this alpha was greater than the initial level during the task. So there was generalization of that resting state to the task as well. The main question is, what happened to people's performance? Because one would expect that normalization may lead to better performance, or maybe not, because if the alpha is higher, maybe they have more mind wandering, therefore they have more errors. So we were curious to see what happened. And in fact, we found a very similar thing with the PTSD group, where an increase in alpha power post neurofeedback was related to an improvement in symptoms. So in this case, it was related to a reduction of commission errors, so errors in impulsivity. So in fact, for those subjects that increased the alpha the most post neurofeedback, they were the ones who decreased most their impulsivity errors. So you could imagine that if alpha is related to an increase in inhibition, that this increase in inhibition decreased their arousal, and then that arousal decrease actually enabled them to reduce their commission errors and reduce impulsivity. So less arousal actually leads to better performance and less impulsive actions, which one could also interpret as impulsivity being over sort of prepotent responses that are due to hyperexcited cortex. So this is the summary that the increase in alpha during the go-no-go task after neurofeedback was related to decreased commission errors. So overall, I just want to give you a summary sort of model of how we think about these effects. And so you have these two extremes, as I told you before, related to these sort of cortically hypoactivated subtypes, EEG subtypes, that would include your classic ADHD with higher alpha or higher theta. Those, usually have high performance errors, but if you decrease that lower frequency power towards intermediate sort of healthy levels here, from high to low to intermediate, and therefore you increase the EI ratio this way because you're decreasing alpha or theta, then you would improve their performance. But if you were to start with this hyperactive type at the beginning instead, because you don't know based on the QG what they look like, so these would be patients that would have higher relative beta power or higher relative gamma and lower alpha or lower theta power, then those with a low alpha amplitude at the beginning would then rebound if you went that direction to go towards the controls, or they might even benefit from increasing alpha directly with heavy plasticity mechanisms. So instead of doing alpha down, you would do alpha up, which is kind of in line with the Penison-Kukolsky kind of protocols for PTSD, for example, and some other protocols of increasing alpha in other populations. So all those, whether they're Hebbian or homeostatic, might lead to improved performance by sort of achieving this intermediate excitation inhibition balance that's sort of reflected by intermediate levels of alpha. relative power. So that's the end of my talk. And the take-home message simply is that if it looks like the brain is erratic, it's not, it's because it's homeostatic. That's it. Thanks very much. And I'll take any questions.
Thank you. Dr. Ross, we do have question from some of our in-person audience. Again, I see they're coming through on the chat. Why don't I go ahead and share the chat with everyone?
Sure, no problem.
Getting some nice compliments. Let's see.
Thank you for the kind compliments.
Let's see. We've got a question from Dr. Robert Condor. Let's see. Fascinating presentation. Are you postulating changes in the relative alpha against baseline or an optimal absolute level for optimal performance?
Yeah, so a very interesting question. I mean, this is the thing about absolute, what does the absolute mean? I mean, of course, absolute power itself is going to depend on, for example, skull thickness. It's going to depend on distance of the cortex to the sensor, to the electrode. It's going to depend on the amplifier sometimes, impedance maybe. So the absolute level of alpha, across subject is very difficult to compare. So that's why in most of these studies I've shown is relative power. And, when you look at the Z scores of relative power measures on QG maps, for example, seems to be like there's, a dynamic range within which this relative alpha power likes to operate in a healthy population. And so I would say Z scores of relative alpha power either more than 3 standard deviations below the mean or 3 standard deviations above the mean indicates, very large distance from the optimal. And so that should be used maybe as a proxy for how far away one is from the optimal in terms of performance or maybe psychiatric problem, right? But of course, there might be other bands that might complicate the picture, like gamma and beta and so on. But in many cases, for adults at least, with alpha, the relative alpha power, should be around those levels that I showed in these slides. So, and that's why we have these normative databases, QG databases that give us indication of what should be the relative alpha power in a person generally on the resting state. Well, hope that answered the question.
Thank you. Next, we'll turn it over to Dr. Jay Gatch to go ahead and ask a question.
Thank you. This is is it on? Fascinating study. Was the alpha training done with eyes open or eyes closed?
Eyes open with visual stimuli. Yeah.
Visual, no auditory stimuli.
There was some auditory, like spaceship. Actually, we used that spaceship game from the EEG or the EEG spectrum.
Okay.
Space race game. Yeah.
All right, and I think you clarified later, but in the first study, were your baseline measures or all your alpha measures eyes closed or eyes open?
All of them are eyes open, actually.
Eyes open. All right, great.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Thank you. And then our next question from chat. Would you care to speculate when one or the other of these processes may be dominant?
I'm not sure about the specific part of that question. You mean the sort of hyper-aroused or under-aroused processes, or dominant in which context? Maybe Barbara can clarify the question.
That I am going to ask Barbara to unmute and see if she can go ahead and clarify.
Okay. Yeah, so my question is really, you talked about Hebbian learning, and then you talked about a homeostatic process. So yeah. How do you see those two relating to each other? And do you see one of those as being a more dominant force at certain times or under certain conditions?
Yeah, excellent question. That's something we've also been thinking about a lot. Why do you sometimes have homeostatic changes and how sometimes you have Hebbian changes, right? How would you expect, which one would you expect, as you say, dominate during or after training? Now, there are some theories about the brain. As I said, why does it even do this homeostatic regulation? And that's to conserve this EI balance, right? and you have to ask yourself, why does it even want to conserve that quantity? Is it because of metabolic reasons? Like if you're constantly very excited, well, you burn up more glucose maybe, so therefore that's why you want to bring it down. But the most convincing theory I found is that it's related to, how brain cells are connected and what are the physiological ceiling pressures in terms of plasticity as well as excitation. So we know that, for example, if you have too much excitation, it can lead to like epilepsy, because the neurons entrain other neurons to fire. So essentially you get the whole brain firing all at once, right? If you have too much excitation. Whereas if you have too little excitation, you end up in a coma, or you have a flatline EEG where basically no neural activities is transmitted from one neuronal population to another, right? So the brain cannot really communicate with other regions because it doesn't entrain other spiking in other networks. So if you consider those two extremes as too much excitation, everything going into an epilepsy, or there's no activity at all, then you'd want the brain to be in this kind of balance, right? Between those two extremes, where the brain is kind of fine-tuned to shut down activity and activate different regions at will, right? Depending on which areas it wants to inhibit, which areas it wants to excite. Now, so there's obviously an optimal level for that. Now, how would you gauge that? How would you predict which way it would go? Now, homeostatic obviously means that if it goes too far out, it will be brought back, but it still has some range within the normal range where it would allow to go into that direction of Hebbian, right? So, for example, in those healthy subjects that we did alpha down, there was no evidence for homeostasis, so alpha homeostasis, in the sense of, they had decreases in alpha after neurofeedback, right? So they were maybe like sort of a little bit under aroused, it was in the morning, whatever, they had some level of alpha, which is maybe just a little bit above the baseline. And then they were able to squeeze the alpha down, and then the brain gave way in that direction, just a little bit like if you have a cup of coffee, you get a little bit more aroused, right? So because it had room that's at the top, it was able to decrease the alpha. But if you look at PTSDs, they already had very little alpha to begin with. That means that they had very little room at the bottom to squeeze the alpha further, although of course during your feedback they can. But then as you excite further and further and further, the alpha stops to pop back up, because it doesn't want to go all the way down to some kind of pathological excitatory levels that may be, pathological in the sense for epilepsy or something like that. So essentially the brain already is bringing back its own activity before it becomes pathological in some sense. And so you could predict that in cases where, if you're more than 3 standard deviations away from the mean in terms of the QEEG, that if you're going then again in that direction, the brain will bring back the system with after neurofeedback, right? But if you're maybe within 1 or 2 standard deviations from the mean, or maybe let's say 1, then it will try to breathe within that and will yield in the direction of the Hebbian way, right? But so for example, if you take ADHD, and then the question is, okay, well, how about ADHD or autism? They have too much theta, and you try to squeeze that down. Now, why is that actually Hebbian rather than homeostatic? Why don't they have an increase in theta when we try to decrease it? And maybe, after a lot of session, if a session is too long, maybe they will have a rebound like that. But if the session is long, sort of maybe 30 minutes or so without creating too much excitability, then the brain will yield over time in the direction towards its optimal. So it somehow presupposes that the brain has some knowledge of where is the optimal for it, and that it moves into that direction, right? Even though it's very far from it. So clinically, why is it that, these ADHD children move towards the lower theta levels? Well, it seems like maybe some kind of conservation of this principle is inherent in the system, but due to bad development, it's far away from the mean, or that optimal mean, and that, you have to kind of help it go in that direction, but it will actually allow you to do that. Whereas if you're going very far away from that sort of physiological optimum, it will bring it back. So that's why I also again call it self-tuning brain, because it seems to know which direction to go irrespective of the training in some sense, which is quite amazing. Anyway, I hope that's answered the question. I don't know, it's kind of complicated. No, we don't have all the answers, honestly.
Oh, I think you're doing a wonderful job, Dr. Ross. Next, we're going to turn the in-person mic to Lexi for a question.
Thank you for the last answers to those questions. It almost
problem.
answered all of my question that I have. With your PTSD study, how much attention was paid to those who were in more dissociative states?
Yeah, we just sort of put them all in one big group. We do know that there are some people with dissociative states. And, I think there's something to be careful about, even using these homeostatic, although I say self-tuning brain, yeah, it sounds wonderful. But in some sense, since we are training the brain and we can see that clearly the brain might not prefer to go in a certain direction and kicks in some mechanisms that bring it back, that you could have even maybe abreactions or negative consequences of moving in the wrong direction. Now, clearly, if you're using a QEEG, by that measure, you know which is the right direction. You're going towards zero z-score. So in that sense, that wouldn't allow you to kick in any homeostatic mechanisms per se, as long as you don't do it too long. But if you're doing QEEG neurofeedback blindly, technically you don't really know what kind of subtype you're looking at here. So for example, this is exactly what happened to us with our research study. We didn't necessarily gauge at the beginning where was the alpha level. And so through the serendipity, we found, okay, well, it looks like alpha was being brought back. But if you're working with an individual patient, they might be an ADHD hyperactive type where the alphas are very low. And then you're asking them to decrease alpha further. Maybe they would have some problem with that. I don't know. I mean, I think I would love to hear some experiences of clinicians as well in this domain. But it's possible that in the association, if it's related to lower alpha and you decrease alpha further, that if the rebound doesn't occur and you're really, really, really low with alpha, that you might have some potential abreaction. Although from the studies that we have done with Ruth Lanius, we haven't seen a lot of evidence for that. But of course, we try to keep the sessions to a limited amount of time, maximum usually of half an hour. So you don't want it to go into overdrive, where you start to have some kind of effects that maybe are sort of negative side effects. Voila. So that's basically, yeah, it's difficult to know whether this dissociation, how this is linked to dissociation. Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. And then I'm going to go ahead and allow Colin to unmute so that he can ask his questions. Colin. There you go, Colin.
Hello, can you hear me?
We sure can.
Great. Yeah. So I actually had two questions. The first one was about meditation, because there's something that puzzles me a bit about meditation, which is that listening to your talk and the link between alpha and the default mode network. So with meditation, you expect that mind wandering is suppressed, therefore default mode network activity is suppressed. Therefore, alpha should go down. But am I right in thinking that most of what you read about the research seems to see it going up?
Yes, that's correct. Yeah. Yeah, it's it's an interesting paradox. Now, the way we actually did some studies of meditation as well, and I can confirm that, yeah, meditation does increase alpha. And usually because it's internal sort of related processing to the breath. So it's not necessarily visual, because alpha is more of a visual thing. So if you think about, if you're kind of blocking vision or you close your eyes, then obviously alpha goes up, and then the more internal you go, alpha goes up further. And then the paradoxical bit is the link with the actual mind wandering, since meditation is supposed to decrease mind wandering. Now, it could be that there's maybe two mechanisms, although I don't know the answer. It could be that with the increase in alpha, there's some kind of homeostatic decrease afterwards. That's possible. Or more plausible for me is that it's not necessarily the level of alpha that's related to the mind wandering, but more the dynamic range of the alpha. So if you have alpha very low, then you're blocking the sort of the breathing of this alpha to inhibit, to inhibit the outside to be able to think internally. But at the same time, even if you do the opposite, if you do very high alpha, but it's kind of tonically active, where it doesn't actually sort of physically decrease or increase, that would be related to maybe thoughts, right? Thoughts is more like you increase and then you decrease and increase and so on. So it has to sort of, the network has to kind of activate, deactivate to go from one thought to the next. But if you keep it tonic, a high level alpha sort of locked for a long time, as sort of these meditative states seem to suggest, then maybe you also sort of put a pause on this whole process of thinking. So whether you lock the alpha high or lock the alpha low, both could be related to low levels of mind wandering, right? That's my explanation, possibly. But it's true that the high alpha is related to the activation of the outside, visually speaking, right? So there's not necessarily a direct link with mind wandering per se. Just it seems to correlate to that if you're doing it well, basically. Yeah. I don't know if that answers your question. If you have another one.
Thank you, Colin. We do have one final question from our virtual audience. I will go ahead and unmute our new board member, Dr. Timothy Herzog, if I can't find him. Sorry, bear with me.
Yep.
Here we go. We will allow him to unmute. Here we go. All right, Tim.
Thanks, Michelle. Great presentation. I'm a relative neurofeedback newbie, although I've been, I've kind of been at it for over a decade, but just diving in really the last couple of years. My question is, might you consider the return to homeostasis to be training fatigue? And would that be a reason to periodize your training so that kind of you're building endurance over time?
Yeah, for sure. I think it's an interesting sort of direction and interpretation. We definitely thought about it also as kind of being equivalent to fatigue in some sense. And if you think, what does fatigue mean? It means that the brain is already sort of gave up already and says, okay, stop now. Don't want to go in that direction anymore. So there, that's why fatigue probably exists. It tells you the same with like muscle fatigue. If you do too much training, well, your muscle starts to become weaker and painful, and then it says, okay, this is a time where I already got your message. You already did, you gave the trigger for the sort of, let's say, building up more muscle, but at some point it has to say, okay, now it's going to become more damaging, and that's why the muscle then says, okay, I can't do any more work. So potentially similar with the brain, you can excite it further and further, but at one point it will say, okay, well, now we've reached the the maximum level of excitation. I will start to erode that back, and that usually behaviorally does feel a little bit like fatigue, and it feels like, okay, your brain is tired. So it's good to probably stop at that point if already during the actual sessions. So the thing that we notice is that during the neurofeedback, the alpha does go down, 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 and then at some point, even during the middle of the session, already starts to creep back up. So you can already kind of have a sense of that rebound already occurring, because the person is not able to squeeze the alpha successfully as well as at the very beginning of the session, right? Because then the inhibition starts to kick in. So, and then of course, if you stop completely, then you have a large amounts of alpha, even bigger than the baseline. But even if you're asking the person, okay, try to really do your best and decrease further, you might need to reach threshold to compensate for this fact that the alpha is increasing, or even maybe if it's beyond maybe half an hour, 20 minutes, to say, okay, well, we seem to have got this rebound. It seems like we've triggered something. Now we take a rest, let the system, sort of recover a bit, find its new sort of middle point, and then go from there. And maybe not even repeat it that very day. I mean, I don't know.
Right.
I don't have enough clinical experience. But yeah,
cool. Right in line with my thinking. That's great affirmation. Thank you. And thank you for your presentation.
Yeah.
Well, and everyone, we want to thank you so much for attending. Dr. Ross, fabulous. Thank you so much. And we look forward to having you back in person. But everyone, we will be sending those CE certificates and the recording, which Dr. Ross has generously agreed to share. With that, we hope you have a beautiful day, and we'll look forward to seeing you for the next session next year, or whenever brings us together again to reconnect. Thank you so much. Have a great day, everyone. Bye, Dr. Ross.
Thank you. Take care.
Everyone.